right, today we're going to talk about aerial photography of eclipses. Well, you break that down to its component parts. You've got three different histories that all come together for these great moments that we're going to, again, celebrate here just in a few days, or probably actually today when you guys are watching this. You've got the aerial part, you've got the photography part, and you've got the oldest part, the eclipse, or when the moon passes between the sun and the earth, and we get this great astrological phenomenon that people have always been really interested in for thousands of years. And of course, that's a very long history that has a lot of social and cultural import in cultures across the world. But that's a little bit a little bit outside of our particular story today. But suffice it to say that even in the 1800s, 1900s, and now the 21st century, it's still a big deal for everybody. And that's why this story actually intersects with what the Air Force's predecessors did and why we took pictures of them. We had known for a long time the sort of math of when eclipses are going to happen, what parts of the Earth they're going to cover. And so astronomers, both professional and amateur, have been, doing observations of these, going on expeditions to see them when they happen for hundreds and thousands of years. And it was no different when it comes to more recent history here in the United States. What about the other two pieces, the aerial, the photography part? When did those come about? Well, the aerial part is slightly older. We're talking there in about the 1780s. You had the Montgolfier brothers in France. You can go look these guys up. They're the first ones that really developed a practical hot air balloon. So they're the really origins of aeronautics, getting people in the air and able to stay there. They're doing this in Paris. You can actually see some great pictures of a beautifully decorated French balloon when they go up in the air. But for them, it's essentially a novelty. Now we're going to fast forward to about the 1830s. You've got another Frenchman, Daguerre. You may have heard, maybe from high school history or college, you've heard of daguerreotypes, or these pictures that were made on these tin plates that are very just kind of black and white. Those are the first kind of surviving photos that we have that were actually done in any sort of quantity. Well, if you have the French doing both ballooning and photography, it wasn't very long after both of those technologies were around that somebody decided, hey, what if we take one of these cameras up into the basket of a hot air balloon and take a great picture? Well, that was actually tried in the 1850s. However, unfortunately for us, none of those photos survived, so we don't know exactly how well it worked or what they looked like, but it would have been wonderful to see. Now, just a couple of years later, there was an American who decided to try the same thing. He took a hot air balloon up above the city of Boston with one of these cameras and took a great picture of the city of Boston. In fact, that photograph is the oldest known aerial photograph that's been taken. You can go online and actually see that, and hopefully we'll put it up here on our episode here, and you can see it for yourself. But it's really impressive. And that wasn't the only one. Some of those followed on from there. But what you would see is that there were problems using balloons. On the one hand, you were essentially either tethered to a single spot, or else if the balloon was floating along, you're moving, but neither of those really make for a great platform if you've got a long exposure time. If you're to have a modern camera and the shutter's open for a fraction of a second, takes a quick picture, great. But if you're swaying in the wind or floating along, you're trying to take a picture that the shutter's open for a few seconds, you're going to end up with something very blurry. So it's not an ideal technology, not really practical, but really more of a entertainment kind of value. It took another probably 50 years before you got to see those two put together in a military sense. You had wars in between, of course, and balloons were applied, as were cameras, to wartime, both in the American Civil War, then later on in wars in Europe, where both of these were used, but essentially independently. You didn't see any kind of regular aerial photography used for any kind of military advantage, at least until World War I. But both of the technologies kept developing in that half century or so before World War I happened. There's a few particular ones we want to talk about, at least in brief. One is by a guy, an American, named George Eastman. Anybody who's old enough may recognize the name Eastman, particularly for Eastman Kodak, the company he founded that became synonymous with pictures, with cameras, particularly those using film. And that was his big invention, was first developing dry plate photography. So instead of having these original kind of metal plates that were coated with a wet chemical that would be exposed and had to be developed like that, he had a dry process, which made it a lot easier to transport and store, these plates for taking pictures. He also developed film. So that is, instead of having one solid piece of metal with the chemicals on it, you could actually have a flexible roll, so that way you could take multiple pictures using a camera without having to insert and remove plates that were first metal and then glass. So that makes it a lot easier to make them small and to carry them around, and really for almost anybody to own a camera. Just like George Eastman and with his Kodak company and development of film helped revolutionize photography, not too far away from where he was working in Rochester, New York, right here in Dayton, Ohio, were a pair of bicycle building brothers that most of you have probably heard of. If you're from Dayton, everybody's heard of them, the Wright Brothers. In 1903, December 17th, they made the first controlled, powered, piloted, manned flight of an airplane. Of course, that happened in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but they were from Dayton. They did all their work right here in Dayton. And that ushered in this age of what we call heavier than air flight. Previously, everything had been balloons, what we call lighter than air. But now that we had an actual airplane, we could do some different things, and aviation was set to really revolutionize how people traveled and how the military could do what they needed to do. And just like with balloons, it wasn't too long before somebody decided to, pair up this camera technology with this new airplane technology. And once again, our friends across the Atlantic Ocean, the French, are the first that we're sure that did this. Although there's an argument to be made that somebody here in Dayton actually took a picture from a Wright Brothers airplane over Hoppin' Prairie, but I just haven't seen that particular one. But the French actually put a movie camera over on a Wright Flyer in 1909 when the Wright Brothers were demonstrating their airplane there to prove that, yes, they could fly and to get customers for their airplane. You can actually go on YouTube and see video footage of this very first film that was made of the Wright Brothers flying around in France. So pretty impressive. But again, while that's cool and good for publicity, it's not really a military useful technology so far. In 1914, there was an astronomer named Dr. James Todd. So he was a guy that, he actually shares my birthday, as I found out. He had been interested in astronomy from a young age. He actually gone to college at age 15 and ended up working for the Naval Observatory, doing astronomical observations. And he had gone around the country and even around the world on different expeditions. But he got fascinated with this idea of observing solar eclipses, and particularly taking pictures of solar eclipses. I think over the course of his career, by the time he died, he observed 19 different eclipses, over half of which were full eclipses and the rest were partial ones. But he had to do this in places all around the world. And he took some of the very first pictures from the ground of these eclipses. He was also one of these pioneers in terms of doing observations from mountaintops. So he actually did an expedition down to the Andes Mountains with a portable observatory to check out Mars and take some pictures of the surface of Mars from that sort of distance. So he appreciated the value of getting cameras above the thick atmosphere, which can distort the images that you get with a camera. But then there's also, air pollution, light pollution, those kinds of things that make taking pictures of things in space from the ground very difficult. So he put these things together in his head, along with his kind of natural aptitude for tinkering with mechanical devices. He had a lot of different inventions, some pretty cool stuff, automatic timers for cameras and multi-camera things. So I mean, really sort of brilliant guy, very eccentric as well, but he had become obsessed with these eclipses. So one of these inventions he got obsessed with was the idea of airplanes. You may have heard the name Samuel Langley. He was the head of the Smithsonian at the end of the 19th century, and he was the first to really, in America, to get funded by the American government to build an airplane. Unfortunately, his did not work so well, and it actually crashed in the Potomac River shortly before the Wright brothers made their successful first flight. And the kind of rivalry there is a very long story that we'll skip today. But the point is, that Dr. Todd got involved with Langley because he was interested in aviation. He had done some balloon flights, and he had actually been one of the founding members of the Aero Club of America. So he saw airplanes as a pretty cool idea. And as you might imagine, it wasn't much of a stretch for him to put those two pieces together and say, hey, can we take pictures of things in space from airplanes? Coincidentally, in 1914, there was a scheduled solar eclipse that was going to pass through Eastern Europe and through Russia. And so he had arranged with the Russian government to have his equipment, including photographic equipment, sent over there. The Russians would provide airplanes to him, and they would actually do the first aerial photographs of an eclipse in real time. Pretty impressive. Now the timing here was a bit suspect. The problem for him was that he wanted to do the airplanes because he had a reputation for most of these eclipses that he would go on. They were almost always cloudy, so he didn't get a lot of good pictures, and he was very frustrated by this. And the airplane thing was a way to get above the clouds and take these pictures. So having arranged with the Russian government to do these seemed like a good idea. He actually shipped his whole family, and astronomers from around the world went to St. Petersburg and other places on this expedition. They were assembling there in St. Petersburg. His equipment was on the way, was on a train, when something else happened at the end of August in 1914. If you've read your history, what happened? World War I broke out. And the Russians, of course, were at the forefront of this at that particular time. What happened? Well, the airplanes he was going to use got, the Russian government who was providing them decided, yeah, we need to actually go use these to fight the war, so he had no airplanes available to him. His equipment got stuck in transit on a train, and they had to flee the country to try to get back to the United States. So after weeks and weeks and taking a circuitous route and hoping they'd get sunk by U-boats, they managed to get back to the United States. But basically that tanked his first episode for taking pictures of an eclipse from an airplane. And it wasn't until 4 years later in 1918 when an eclipse was going to cross the United States that somebody proposed this idea again. And it was an American officer who had worked with the Navy. He at least wrote about this idea, but as far as we can tell, there wasn't any actual execution of it. And it wasn't until a few years later after that we were able to take the first pictures. But first we've got to talk about the technology development piece.